Thanks so much, Liz. Really happy to be here. They say truth is stranger than fiction until a true story winds up inspiring a novel, which is where things can get really strange. What makes a true story catnip to an author? How does that author decide what to keep and what to discard or what to change? What's the difference between fiction based on true stories and historical fiction? We're going to learn about a genre or a style that crosses many lines with Kate and Brandon and Paul today. Kate Reed Petty is the author of True Story, a novel. Paul of The Coldest Warrior, a novel. And Brandon of Real Life, a novel. So I'm really delighted to have all three of you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I am going to go ahead and read your bios and then ask each of you to say just a couple of sentences about your book, just what you would, maybe your elevator pitch, if you will. So I'll start with Kate. Kate Reed Petty lives in Baltimore. Her fiction and essays have been published online by Electric Literature, American Short Fiction, Blackbird, the Los Angeles Review of Books blog, and Ambit. Her work has been supported by many grants, including a Ruby's grant from the Deutsch Foundation, a Tennessee Williams scholarship to the Sewanee Writers Conference. And this is really cool. In 2018, she was a writer in residence at the Mount, which is Edith Wharton's home in Massachusetts. That is, a dream. In addition to fiction, her short films have appeared on Narrative magazine and at the 2019 Maryland Film Festival, so she is multimedia talented. She's the co-author of the middle grade graphic novel Casma Nights with artist Boya Sun. That came out from First Second Books in 2018. So now you know a little bit about Kate. Brandon next is the author of the novel Real Life, which was a New York Times editor's choice. His work has appeared in Guernica, American Short Fiction, Gulf Coast, BuzzFeed Reader, everywhere. Oh, the Oprah Magazine, Gay Mag, the New Yorker Online, the Literary Review, and elsewhere. He's the senior editor of Electric Literature's Recommended Reading and a staff writer at LitHub. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Iowa Writers Workshop. That is pretty cool, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow. And last but not least, Paul, because his name starts with V, Paul Vidich's third novel, The Coldest Warrior, is forthcoming from Pegasus Books in February 2020, which means it is already out, not forthcoming. Go buy it. Go buy all of these books, by the way. I'll talk more about that later. His debut, An Honorable Man, was selected by Publishers Weekly as a top 10 mystery and thriller in 2016, followed by The Good Assassin, which was published as was his first book by Atria Emily Bessler Books at Simon & Schuster. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, LitHub, Crime Reads, Fugue, The Nation, Narrative Magazine, and elsewhere. Junot Diaz selected his story Jump Shot as a winner of the 2010 Fugue Short Story Contest. Very cool. And his story Falling Girl was nominated for a 2011 Pushcart Prize. So that is summing up our three panelists. And you really are quite a great group. I know we have a lot to talk about, but I hope that each of you will tell us a little bit about your latest book. And if you want to work it into the panel theme, great, but you don't have to. So how about we go from right to left, starting with you, Brandon?
Yeah, so my novel, as you said, is Real Life, published by Riverhead Books. And it's really about one of those pivotal weekends in the sort of last little bit of your adolescence when you wake up one morning and realize you've made a series of concessions to survive your life circumstances, and what happens when you're no longer willing to continue making those concessions. And it follows Wallace, who's a queer Black man from the South, navigating an ostensibly progressive white liberal city in the Midwest and trying to figure out how to be a scientist and a person in the world.
Excellent, thank you. And there's so little to relate the two in there. I mean, none of us has ever made a mistake, right? Kate, how about True Story? Sorry, Brandon, sorry.
I hope it's not too self-promotional to hold up my book, but I just
got
the covers yesterday, so I'm very excited about them. It's out August 4th, True Story, so it is very on brand for this panel. Thank you for naming it that. It's a book about, I like to say it's a book about men and women and the politics of storytelling. So the book starts with a rumor of a sexual assault that happens at a high school lacrosse party in the late 90s. And that rumor radiates through the lives of 4 characters for the next 20 years. And the book also switches genre as it goes, and it plays with found documents. There's screenplays, college application essays in there. And I used that kaleidoscopic structure because I kind of wanted to explore how we tell stories and how we decide what is the truth based on all of these different kinds of pieces of evidence that gets put together. So ultimately, it's a book about how the story of violence is also kind of an expression of power.
Excellent, thank you. Lots to talk about in our questions for both of those books. Paul, how about The Coldest Warrior?
It's different than the other 2 books in that it's basically a story of government cover-up. It's about an iconic case, the case of Frank Olson, who was a bioweapons scientist who died mysteriously in 1953 when he fell or jumped from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel, and then was shipped back to his family in Fort Detrick, Maryland, in a closed casket. And they knew nothing about his death and really about his work for 22 years when the Rockefeller Commission came out and in a small paragraph at the back said that he had been, they didn't even name him, but they said a scientist had given LSD the week before and then had died mysteriously. The family connected the dots. The CIA admitted that it had been him. And suddenly there was a waterfall of information about his life and death. But as it turned out over the years, that waterfall of information was largely misinformation. And the death and the way that men in power gave themselves the dubious privileges on behalf of national security became the story that was most interesting. And so it's a spy novel, but it's really a story about a family and how people find themselves victims. Not like the way we feel victimized at the moment in the current political environment. This happened to involve a murder.
Oh, we'll get there. I also want to mention that this story, which is such a powerful historical one, is also the one that formed the basis for the television series Wormwood.
Correct.
And so it's got, each of the ways you're handling the truth is different, but each of these books does look at that, and it looks at where truth and fiction collide. And I think that's what was so exciting about putting the 3 of you together here for me. So the differences between the books are just as interesting as the similarities. So I have a question for all of you, and we can go back and forth. I know, unfortunately, with Zoom, the really tough thing is we can't talk over each other. And, I would love to do that. I'd love it that if we were just in a coffee shop, just having a conversation, but it is a panel. So I'll be very careful. Which came first for you individually, the truth or the story? And I'll let whomever would like to take that start.
I'll go.
Okay.
So, in my case, it was clearly the story because the truth kept being put off. And it was one of these things where they started with very little information, and then the circumference of facts continued to widen. But there was an ongoing effort to hide the truth to what happened. And it was only with the distance and perspective of 40 or 50 years that enough facts had been assembled to be able to say, that's likely what happened. All the evidence points towards murder and none of it points away. And it was when that happened, and I should say that Frank Olson was my uncle. So I have a personal connection. This story was about my aunt and my cousins, and I lived with this. I was 3 years old when he died, but we were very close as families. And so I lived with this mystery, and I saw the pain in the family. The aunt became an alcoholic, the son blamed the mother, And all of that clouded what was sort of beneath all of that, which was the question, what really happened? And why did he die? And it was only 40 years later, when they exhumed the body, that they began to suspect it was murder. And it was only when all of those facts were assembled that I could say, okay, this is not a story about, Frank Olson accidentally dying after having been given LSD. This is a story about a man who knew too much, and having been made unstable was now a security risk. And the question became, what do you do with a security risk in the United States in 1953? When you're fighting the Korean War, and you don't have a gulag to send this person to? How do you deal with a man with state secrets in his head who you're afraid is going to say the wrong thing?
This is being broadcast publicly. Don't give anyone any ideas about a gulag, okay? I'm sorry.
That will get to your last question.
Exactly. Now, Brandon, for you, obviously you had lived the truth. When did you decide that it was going to be something that would be turned into a novel? Because you have written nonfiction, you've written essays about your life, and they're very powerful. But clearly, writing fiction was something you needed to do and did something different for you.
Yeah, I mean, fiction for me never feels like work. Like, it always feels like pleasure and fun. And so I love writing fiction, and nonfiction always feels like I'm doing the hardest work with the smallest, least facile part of my brain. It's always really hard. So if I had my druthers, I'd always pick fiction. But, I didn't write a lot of fiction about my life. Like, that to me always seemed like a thing that I wanted to sort of stay away from. And so I was content to write little short stories about people who were nothing like me, and about things that had nothing to do with my life, until I got this literary agent who kept pestering me for a novel, even though I kept saying, I'm a story writer. And eventually just became very clear that he wasn't going to take me seriously until I just gave him a novel. And I had tried to write novels before, and I had failed for a whole host of reasons. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to write this novel, then I need to make sure that I succeed. I need to get to the end of it. And so I made a list of, reasons I'd failed. And one of those reasons was that I dedicated a lot of energy in my fiction to coming up with the really base facts of the fictional world in some ways. I dedicated all this energy to and this character has this job, and this character has that job, and they live on this street, which I've constructed out of, I spent all of my energy trying to create just the surface material.
Mm-hmm.
So when it came time to do plot or action or character, I had no energy left. I had run out of stamina. And so I thought, okay, how do I avoid that? Well, one way to avoid it is to just lift the surface of my life out of reality and to sort of move it into fiction, and to sort of begin to interrogate some of those questions that were coming up in my daily life. And what I found was that fiction provided, a kind of virtual space that I could revisit moments or think through things that had happened to me or that people had said to me and done to me. And I was living a really intense life at the time. I was a research assistant,
Right.
In a stem cell lab, working 15, 17-hour days and being microaggressed all the time by these really polite Midwestern people who had never seen a Black person before. And so it really, what started out as a kind of very mercenary idea that okay, I'll just take a shortcut and take real things and put them into a fictional space and turn them over and interrogate them, really became it became really interesting. I began to sort of think about what does make something real, what does make something true, and what are some more interesting permutations of reality that I can access through a fictional space. And so, yeah, I mean, it started out with a really kind of silly, shortcutty attitude, but it became quite difficult because when you're working with real material, there is a responsibility there. And you do need to think about, why not just make something up? If I'm going to use this reality, do I stay very close to it? Do I depart from it? When do I depart from it? You know, it was quite interesting technically to think through those questions and problems. But yeah, it began, I guess the truth came first, and then I decided I needed to write a story. And in order to sort of save time, I just took all the sort of surface matter of my life and put it into the novel. And then it changed very quickly because
well, we're gonna get more to that too. But Kate, I love what Brandon was just saying about these details, because one of the things you do in True Story, as you mentioned a little earlier, is to take all of these documents and examine how they contribute to an essential truth in our society. True Story is a novel, but there is so much truth in it, maybe even more truth than there is in Brandon's real life, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's well said what you say about that. It is a true story, even though the novel is entirely fictional.
Yes.
And Brandon, I also like what you said about just the responsibility of telling true stories. Part of the reason everything in the book is fictional is because I didn't want to take on any real facts. I didn't want to take anything from real life people, but at the same time, I did want to reflect something that is real and that is happening all too often. The other thing I'll say about sort of, you know, the stories did come first, and sort of my anger came first. I think a lot of this novel was kind of baked in like 2000, well, I graduated college in 2006, and kind of for the next 10 years, there was this kind of steady drip of really horrific, high-profile sexual assault cases, especially kind of driven by social media and bullying. But these were things that have been happening for generations. So there was a lot of anger, and I've wanted to write about these things for a long time. But so I guess that's the truth, and I mixed up the truth and the story. That's the truth behind it. But the story, the way I was sort of able to write about it was realizing that through fictionalizing it, there wasn't really a possibility for like a happy ending or a enjoyable read through these issues. And so I think there was always a feeling of weight and needing to really, you know, give full credit to the lack of justice that we see so often. But by telling it in a novel, I feel like what I was hoping to do was to put the reader in a slightly more uncomfortable position, partly by giving them something that they could enjoy reading, so that they could be sucked into the story and absorbed in it, but also be hopefully, you know, pushed to challenge their own concepts of what the truth is and who they are choosing to believe at any moment in this story as it's unfolding. So the truth came first, but the story is what made me excited to write it.
Well, I'm going to go straight into another question for you then, Kate, because that's what I said to you when I sent some questions, that your story confronts this combination of truth and fiction head on. You know, there's at no point does the reader think that this is an actual true story, nor does the reader really know if anything was taken from real life, because it's all so very carefully crafted. And I know that was deliberate. So you've talked a little bit about why that's crucial to your plot. When did you get to the point when you knew you were going to make the combination? Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think you touched on it, but I'd like to hear more.
When I got to the point where I was able to make the combination, I mean, the first section of the book it is told in the voice of this kind of dumb jock white bro in late 90s suburban Maryland. He's the kind of guy I was terrified of myself in high school. I never thought that I would write that story. Mm-hmm. And so I started out writing him, and it was surprised me that his voice kind of came out of me. I think some of that, and I deal with this a little bit in the book, some of that is because we've all heard that story so many times for decades, even if it's not our personal story.
Right.
So Nick was and I sort of originally started it thinking that I was going to punish him in some way, or that I was just going to write a really vicious story about this guy that I did not like. And then I realized that, I mean, for one thing, that's a horrible book to read. That's just a vindictive book. It's not fun. And I was sort of surprised by the affection and the way that I was sort of able to understand the way that he was also kind of being punished by our culture and kind of constrained. And so I guess it was, I mean, that's sort of a piece of myself that changed through the course of the writing, was realizing that, you know, I think that the power structures of our society hurt everybody. They hurt people differently and they hurt people in different amounts, but the Nicks of the world are still kind of constrained by what they're perpetrating, I would say.
That's very interesting. And Brandon, I'm going to go over to you for a second. I actually had the honor of reviewing Real Life for the LA Times. And one of the things that surprised me, because I thought, you know, from the cover and just what I knew about you, you are, you know, I love, for example, Brandon on Twitter is all about great sweaters. And, you know, the book has deep and violent and complicated relationships in it. There is nothing, you know, even though this is happening, as you said, Brandon, at a, you know, point in life when people are young and before they've really decided, you know, what they're going to do, there is nothing warm and fuzzy. It's not a bunch of kids sitting around on a sofa surrounded by stuffed animals, you know. These are fundamental things, very, very important. And so in taking some of those questions from your own life, did it change what you thought about the past in your own life? Did you find the story changing as your perspective on how fiction touched on the truth changed? Does that...
Yeah, I mean, I have a sort of silly, quick answer to that and a sort of more thoughtful one. And the more silly, quick answer is that, you know, I wrote the novel and then went back to Madison to see some friends, you know, like 6 or 7 months after the novel was done, and found myself at a table with some of the people who inspired little bits of characters. And they had a conversation that I had written verbatim into the book that I had made up, you know, just like one of the most fictional moments in the novel happening right before my very eyes.
Which one? Which conversation?
I mean, one of the conversations about an advisor figure that
oh my gosh, that's incredible.
And I had to sort of go back to the novel and quickly like try to like take it even more into a realm of fiction. But and so like, yes, there is this like curious correspondence between my actual life and what ends up being in the book in fragments and shards ultimately. But yeah, like writing the novel, to me, it was an opportunity to sit with some of the more uncomfortable moments and incidents from my time in Madison, and to really, you know, like I had experienced them from my side of the table. So I knew how I felt about, you know, certain things that people said and did to me. And I knew what I had experienced in that moment. And I knew that experience in that moment was like curtailed by my own like human self and my own immaturity in some ways. And so I took the novel as an opportunity to go back into those spaces and to not just sit on my side of the table, but to also go to the other side and to sort of give that person, even though they're doing something awful in that moment, to give them the full benefit of their convictions, you know, to sort of think very deeply about how, like when a person says that, like that's coming from a particular place in their life. And when it had happened to me in sort of actual time, I hadn't thought about that. I'd only thought like, wow, what a terrible thing to say to me. How dare you?
There's a lot of class consciousness in the novel. And yeah, and there's some really, really unkind, ugly things that people say. Well, and what surprised me, Brandon, is they weren't necessarily things about race. They were things about socioeconomic status. People are awful.
I mean, there are no ways that we wound each other, you know, and I didn't want to, I guess I ultimately didn't want the conflicts and the tensions to feel very simple, because often it doesn't just boil down to race. Like often it boils down to something really specific between those two people, and they're bringing the full weight of their background and their own situations. And so I wanted every conflict to have multiple valences, because that's why so many of these conversations stick with us months and years later, is because, you know, it was like a multi-front attack on your person in some ways, and there are no easy answers ultimately. And so Yeah, I mean, writing some of those moments out in the novel and working on them and revising them and making them more complicated, you know, pass after pass, did give me, I think in some ways, like a more nuanced understanding of the people who had said and done things to me in my own life. And so I do think the novel gave me a more like robust moral intelligence with which to move through the world. And I think that's one of the great things about fiction, is that it lets you sort of get the last word, but hopefully you've done some thinking.
Isn't that true? And you know that, Paul, I want to move to you with that, because you know, here is a story that is historical. It's part of our government. It's part of a legacy of really sad truths in our government, but it's also a personal story for you, Paul. And I wonder, did it change your views of your family? Did it change your views of, you know, the aunt who was an alcoholic, for example?
Um, I don't think it changed the views of my family. The question for me
The views
was,
you have for your family, not their views.
right, no, my views. The I was much closer in some ways to my aunt than her son was, and because there was a division in the family, where the son was very angry at the mother, for not having pursued more information about what happened in 1953. And I was at her deathbed, and he was not. And, you know, some very powerful and emotional things came out of this. But on the other hand, I have great admiration for my cousin, because he has dedicated his life to answering the question, how did my father die and why? And there's a bit of Hamlet in this story, where somebody is obsessed with something to the extent that they leave many other parts of their life behind. And so the story itself has created, you know, powerful emotional resonance for me and others. The question for me became, how do I step back from that powerful resonance? Because it's easy to write a revenge story, right? But that's not what I wanted to do. And it was only when I got further enough away and saw that everything pointed to murder, nothing pointed away, that I tried to write the story. And I tried to write it from my cousin's point of view, answering the question, how did he die and why? And ultimately, it didn't work because I was unable or unwilling to take the emotional risks about some of the things in the family that you would need to have done in order to really create the powerful story. That is the story that was told by in Wormwood. But the other problem is that it never answers the question, if I had done that, you know, who murdered him? And so I decided to take the point of view of people within the CIA. I wanted to look at the mindset of those men who were complicit in the murder.
And they were all men.
And they were all men. And they, in my case, you know, young men at the time, who then went on in the novel to have big careers. And I wanted to ask the question, how do they deal with the guilt of the choices they made when they were young men in order to be ambitious and to get ahead? And then to find 23 years later that the curtain is pulled up and suddenly they have to deal with the past. So it's this dialogue between their present lives and the past secrets that they carry with them. And I structure this so that there is an answer to the question of who killed him.
Right.
And
no spoilers in this panel.
Well, it starts off with the murder. So anybody who's looking for the spoiler, just read the first chapter. But there is a quote from Albert Camus that has always struck with me, and I think it's relevant for each of us as authors here, and that is that fiction is the lie that we tell in order to reveal the truth. And it is, in fact, how I think of my novel. The truth is unknown in the sense that there isn't enough evidence that could be uncovered to create a court case that would lead to an indictment. But on the other hand, we know what the truth is. And the question becomes is how do you present that truth to the world in a way that is both instructive, but also entertaining? and that's what I tried to do with the novel.
And as you know, I think you succeeded very well. And this leads me to a question that anyone can pop up and answer. In reading these books, and clearly I put the panel together, so it's something that really matters to me, this question of combining truth, history, personal history, etc., with fiction. Are we going to see more and more stories like this in a way because we're now able in some ways to cope with more truth? And of course, I said we were going to talk at the end about how the idea of truth versus lies has changed in the past few years, but we can talk about it just in terms of books and fiction for the moment. Are we going to see more and more novels that have woven material from true events, or have we always had those novels?
I'll go. I was going to say that I think we've always had those novels. And I do think that one thing that's intimidating about the current situation is that things are so crazy, so ludicrous, so bizarre. It's really hard to think about how you could write a novel that would capture the chaos of the world in a more effective way than the chaos that we live every day. And I do think that this question of truth and story is daunting right now, because it's a little bit, in some ways, in my mind, not so much truth and story, but fact and fiction, and falsity, which is a little bit what we saw in the Soviet Union. Who writes the story that becomes the narrative that we live by? And I think we're living in a world in which there is no authority where you can say, okay, let's read the New York Times to know what's happening. I think right now you've got opinion, you've got social media, and it's distorting our view of the world. So we all live in our smaller worlds where we're comfortable, but there isn't what I'll call, the overarching approach to authority and narrative. And I think that's a tectonic shift. Maybe we'll go back to what it had been like, but I think it's for I'd like to hear from the other authors. I think this is true politically. I think it's true culturally, and I think it's something that we as authors, I know I struggle with.
I don't really know what Paul's talking about at all. I'm kidding. It is a tectonic shift. So Kate or Brandon, what is your opinion here?
I think that I think that for many people, history has always been a collective fiction told from some point of view that isn't their own. I agree that there is a kind of atomization of authority, especially in our sort of like in the New York Times or the New Yorker, which when I was a wee tot, I always thought that if you read it in a newspaper, it must be entirely true 100%. But you can go back like 20, 30 years and read things that they wrote about, things that were contemporary then that we now know to be entirely just, like false. I can't imagine that there's a Black person in America who picked up the New York Times in 1965 and felt that they were getting the whole story. There's something about the idea of like our national truths and our national history, which have always felt kind of like porous and fungible to me. And so I do think that there is a kind of convergence. And what we're seeing is this convergence between nonfiction and fiction. And what I imagine is that it's happening in places where it didn't used to happen, like the New York Times. Like I feel like what we're seeing is a willingness to admit that those facts aren't so like quick dried and quick set. I think we're starting to really acknowledge some of the cracks that have always been in the firmament of our national discourses and our national narratives. And what that means to me as an artist is that I try to go to the page to tell the truth, and I'm always trying to be really, really honest in my own work. And that sort of idea of truth is not fixed, like it's always kind of squirreling around in the distance.
Right.
But what feels ultimately true to me, you know, I go back to D.H. Lawrence's idea of moral art, and that being art that seems to preserve the natural correspondences between things, which is that as artists, we're always trying to observe those relations between things in the world as we see them, and to sort of dictate something true about them on the page. And that's ultimately like my own metric of art, is that I'm not fudging the relations between things. And so I can't necessarily give you the whole overarching truth of the universe, but I can tell you about these two objects, you know, in this moment as I observed them.
I really love that answer. And when you were talking about porosity and fungibility, it also makes me think of brittleness, and
yeah.
how some of these things really need to be broken into pieces, shattered. And of course, Kate, that makes me think of True Story, because what we've seen is so frightening. I read in Caitlin Moran's new collection, which is called More Than a Woman. I love her. She's very funny, but she was pointing out, and this comes back to you, I promise. She was pointing out how much progress has been made for women in the last century or so. And it really is remarkable when you actually type it out and you see it, because she was saying, look, you know, men are kind of still stuck. And as you mentioned, Kate, a little while ago, there are things that we have that are truths that hurt everyone. But if women have made all this progress, and you know, we have, it's amazing considering the millions of years in the past, how much better things are for women. Is it because of that truth? Is it a fundamental truth or a fundamental wounding? I think I know what you'll say, that causes violence against women.
I mean, I think that, I mean, the first thing I want to say is just that I do think that our literature reflects the like biggest questions of society. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that books are increasingly reflecting more voices reflects, I think, what our society is going through, which is trying to learn to listen authentically and honestly to everyone's voices, which we just have never done. I think, I won't speak to human history, but American history we have not done, as Brandon said really well. I think the issue of women's rights is a really interesting question, because women are both, you know, historically marginalized, but also white women are very privileged right now in our society. And so I feel like we, you know, I'm speaking about my own experience, but I think this is true of everybody. We have to look at the ways that we have been silenced, and also the ways that we have been a bystander or a contributor to the silence of others. And so I think, just to bring back to, with books, I mean, just to your question about like the future of books, I think that's what we will continue to see as, you know, books in the next 10 years, wrestling with what it means to listen to everybody and to actually hear, and for some of us to speak up. You know, I think maybe this feels like a little bit off topic, but it feels important to me also. I feel like 20 years ago, there was, or even 10 years ago, there were lots of sort of memoir scandals, like there would be a yes. lie, right? And that doesn't happen right now. I can't think of one recently. Like there's J.T. Leroy and James Frey. And if they do happen, they're not as big of a deal, right? It's sort of a smaller blip. There's so much more news. But I think it also reflects that our society, like, there's like, and maybe it's that people don't think they can get away with it anymore. Like despite the feeling that like we have huge people in power lying so blatantly, I think more people are feeling the pressure and the skill that it takes. And I'm not even sure what it takes, but to actually tell the actual truth and to stand by it. So.
And as we have been talking about, you can tell the truth through fiction. And that's something that never stops amazing me. Go ahead, Brandon.
Oh, I was just thinking about the Memoir Scandal, because like that's so true. And I was also, it also made me think about how like sometimes when you put something in a novel that someone from your life recognizes, and they're like, yeah, that didn't happen that way. And you're like, yeah, it's fiction. You know, like it's this like weird dual hyper expectation of like
Exactly.
a fact inside of novels somehow.
You know, like you didn't make me up in your imagination in a true way. You know, no, it is crazy. And I hear about that all the time. In fact, I just had, this is also, talk about another honor. Deborah Jo Emmergut has a new novel out called You Again, which is really delightful. I urge people to take a look at that. But I had interviewed her a couple of years ago for Books Are Magic. And so in this new book, she named a character after me. And I thought it was really funny because I just, you know, of course, went and read, you know, it's a minor character, but, you know, she gave her my lipstick, she gave her my hair, you know, it's the sweetest thing. And she said it was just a little way of me thanking you for what you do for books. And I thought, you know, I guess if there's a really evil character named after you, you might be upset, but I didn't care what this character was doing, or, you know, it's such a flattering thing. So, but I do know that there are plenty of situations, as you were saying, Brandon, in which people, you know, want something different. And I know we only have a couple more minutes before we go over to questions from our viewers, but I would love to ask first about what's coming next for all of you, because Paul, you have a new book that's already like landing on my doorstep. It's so exciting. You know, I'd love to know if your next works have to do with a combination of truth and fiction or not. But whatever you want to say, because I also know if you don't want to talk about work that's upcoming, I'm not going to force you.
No, I'm happy to. It's I moved away from a family situation to a situation that is important to me, but more remote. In that it's a story about East Germany and the Stasi and the fall of the wall.
I lived in Berlin, so.
Well, then I'll have to have you read it, because it's but it's a story about surveillance and how surveillance by the state on our lives changes our lives and what we do to preserve privacy. And this sort of takes place before the fall of the wall and after the fall of the wall. And it is a spy novel. I like to think of it as a literary spy novel. So there are the tropes of the spy novel, but there's some very powerful characters in the book that, you know, I got very close to. And I do think surveillance as a issue in our lives is a powerful thing. It's not just state surveillance, it's Facebook surveillance,
it's so
Twitter
relevant.
surveillance.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. And you know, what is privacy, you know, in the world we live in?
Title? What's the title?
Well, actually, there are two books and I've conflated them. The one I'm telling you now is the one that's coming out, which is almost done. That's called The Matchmaker.
Okay.
And the one that is, I think you were referring to, is called The Mercenary.
Excellent.
But in any case, both, you know, I don't know if it's true of the other authors, but your best book is always the one you've just written. So
Of course.
I'm very close to this last one, which is why I'm talking about it.
My best book is one I haven't written. I'm sorry.
What are you working on one right now? Can you tell us anything?
Are you? I'm gonna be the like kind of stick in the mud with this question. But I about a year ago realized that I have to keep the second novel I think is really difficult, and I have been keeping it a complete secret. But I think maybe hopefully that will be as intriguing as if I pitched it.
That is intriguing. Total Secret, Kate Reed Petty. No, that's not the title. I'm kidding. Brandon, how about
you? So directly next is a book of short stories called Filthy Animals, and that comes out next summer. But also some secret things, some secret novel things, which hopefully I'll be able to reveal more about soon. But the project I'm sort of deepest on is a novel about museums and the contemporary art market, and you know, it's sort of The Devil Wears Prada meets Billions, but set in a museum in the Midwest.
I already love this. I just was talking about Miranda Priestley in my workshop.
Gosh, I'm obsessed. So it's a novel. It's called Group Show, but that'll be hopefully more on that soon.
I hope we hear more on that soon. That is fascinating. Brandon, I should just mention, was the one who got me to read The Chiffon Trenches by Andre Leon Talley, which is one of my books of the year, even if it's not necessarily the best because he repeats himself quite a bit. It's so powerful. It's so interesting. I'm probably the least fashiony person to be as obsessed with Vogue as I am, but I am, and also obsessed with ALT. But sorry, back on track for true stories and fiction. So we don't have any questions right now, which is fine because I can just keep talking with you guys, and that is so exciting. So one of the things I'd love to know is if there are other authors whose work inspired you or who you look to in working on these kinds of novels that do fuse fact and fiction.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Karl Ove Knausgård's My Struggle. I know that that's, a lot of people have a lot of feelings about him, but I've always found those books like deeply moving and really interesting. And I cannot get enough of them. They're also like way too long, but I just love to live inside of them. And when it came time to write my novel, like I did think very deeply about his book. I was like, well, he did it. I can do it too. I can sort of lift fiction. And so, Knausgård and, writers like Rachel Cusk and Ben Lerner, and Zabald for sure, and Thomas Bernhardt, who sort of repurpose like real things in the world for their work. So when I sat down to write real life, I had a set of correspondences in my mind.
That's really interesting because it also makes me think of autofiction, like you said, Olivia Lang's books. They're really fascinating to me. When I first saw that kind of writing and heard the term autofiction, it didn't, there was something, I couldn't wrap my head around it. It was almost like, what are you doing? Because this is, as we said a little while ago, people have been writing truth combined with stories for hundreds of years. And so I thought, what is different about this? And now I understand a little bit better, both from the literary viewpoint and the writing viewpoint. But I still think we have to remember that all of the great novelists were putting truth in there, were finding ways. I mean, Balzac, Hugo, the French realists in so many ways, taught us a lot about this. But how about you, Kate, in terms of what I'm going to call pastiche, and I might not be correct?
Yeah, I think, I'm going to say Nabokov because I have to say that is like a definite touchstone for me. And just like I feel like Pale Fire is like the heart of what I'm always trying to do. And sort of the opposite, the other sort of huge touchstone is Grace Paley, who's definitely meta in a much more subtle way, but the way that she like breaks the fourth wall with her stories and plays with storytelling has been really important.
I love that. I love that. And you couldn't find two more different writers, could you?
Yeah, but they both make me cry. So it's like, I feel like they do it for somehow.
There you go.
Yeah, the other book I want to talk about and thinking about pastiche is that I do love genre fiction, and I love the ways that so many different kinds of writers are playing and blending genres. Like Paul, I love talking about a literary thriller. There's a book that came out. Victor Lavalle is an author. I just adore his work.
Yes.
He edited an anthology called A People's Future of the United States that I think came out last year. It's just a great read, and just like, it's a collection of short stories by, I think, 30 different authors, but just shows what you can do, how you can tell the truth through science fiction and horror and speculative fiction, and just like these really twisty, playful things that I think it's really thrilling. And I think it's great that kind of genre play is, widely respected. And
N.K. Jemisin's The City We Became is one of my huge books right now.
She's got a great piece, in this collection, yeah.
Oh, we have a question. So what is the question? I don't know yet. This is exciting. It's just so exciting that we're actually all in our living rooms, you know, having a literary festival. I'm kind of like, why would we ever go out again? But that's a writer for you.
I can read the question.
Oh, please.
I just opened it up. It says, from Megan Medeiros. Are any of you all interested in counter histories? Excluding...
No, example.
Oh, example, include the Handmaid's Tale and Kindred. What do you think of the kind of work being done? How does it compare to the true fiction work you're doing and that you're trying to accomplish? And what are you trying to accomplish with that
Great
work?
question, Megan. Thank you.
I would say one quick thing about The Handmaid's Tale. I always remember Margaret Atwood saying that everything that happens in that book has something that humans have done to other humans in history, that it's, you know, even though it is a speculative world, it's not, she says it's not made up. And so I think I am interested in the ways that, again, like, it's almost like a spoonful of sugar, that it's a way for us to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this horrible thing the author made up. And you tear through it. And then at the end you realize, oh, this is actually the world that we live in. And so it's a way for us all to kind of be reminded of politics and important issues. Yeah.
You know, I think that alternate histories, speculative histories, all of it's so important for us in this moment. It's the kind of thing that I want to read. My husband is a huge audiobook fan. And if I had couple of years ago, before he started listening to audiobooks, tried to get him to read Emily St. John Mandel, he would have been like, what? A book by, you know, a novel? Oh no, I read nonfiction. Now he's listening to more and more fiction, and he just listened to Station 11, and it completely captivated him. He said, tell me more about this book. Tell me more about what it means. It's so odd. It's so sad. It's so terrible. And I said, okay, well, you know, that's fine. You got it. I don't need to, you know, give you a literary lesson on it. You know, you got it. It's odd. It's sad. It's terrible. It's evoking emotions from you, which is hardest for him. For some of us, what's harder is to get the emotions into communicable prose, right?
Right. So I think alternate histories are wonderful. In some ways, I'm thinking that the first alternate history was the Aeneid, which is written by Virgil in order to glorify the founding of Rome. So it wasn't really what happened with the founding of Rome. It was his glorification. Mm-hmm. And the reason it worked so well is it was a powerful narrative. It had wonderful characters. I mean, Dido happens to be probably one of the most durable, you know, wonderful, complex female characters ever written. Mm-hmm. And it came out of what I'll call an alternate history. So the reason these types of works succeed is because they're character driven, they're thematically driven, and they're wonderful stories. So I think it's just a question, how powerful is the story you want to tell, and who are the characters that you're going to tell it through?
How about that alternate history known as Genesis?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry, I went there. But I think, Paul, your point is well taken, that authors, including, as Kate mentioned, Atwood, have so much material to work with in human history. You know, there's nothing new under the sun, but you can make it new. And all three of you have done that in different ways. This is why, I think it's so powerful when there is something absolutely true, not completely invented, which is one of the problems I have when there's a really complicated, let's say, space opera that has nothing to do with human behavior. There are some space operas, believe me, that I love, but when you get one that is very without affect and without connection to what humans really are, I think that's really tough for humans to relate to. The stories that you're telling are stories, all three of you, that are so closely tied to real life to A True Story, to the Cold War. It's very powerful material. And I'm wondering too, we have a couple more minutes. I don't know, I don't think we have any more questions right now. And Megan, I hope we answered yours to a good extent. I'm wondering how long these books take. How, if you wouldn't mind talking about that for a couple of minutes before we close.
I mean, my book, Real Life, I wrote in span about 5 weeks, I think. Like that.
Oh my goodness.
That book came out really, really quickly because I decided like once I was gonna do it, I was just gonna like hop on the thing and just like do it because I didn't want to like I didn't want to spend like a long time on it because I just like didn't trust myself to finish it.
But then you put it aside.
Yeah, for about I finished it in May of 2017, and then we sold it in January. And so between that May and January, I didn't touch it at all. I just like because I thought it was a bad novel. Yeah, so like I had put it away for a bit after I wrote it. But it took me my entire life to live all the stuff that I used.
Good answer.
You know, you sort of live your entire life in order to get one book out, and then you've got to do it again and again and again.
You know, I wish we could have a virtual drink right afterwards. It's so early in the day. Kate, how about you? How long did True Story take?
Man, I wish it took 5 weeks. That's amazing. I guess it took about 2 years to write in the first span, and there were sections that came quickly, and then there was a lot of thinking in between to fit it together. I felt like because it is as you said, the book is kind of a collage, and so at first I was like, oh, I'm cheating because I'm like writing these fun different sections and hopping around, and I can just fit them all together. And then it took a long time to fit them together, but yeah, I guess 2 years. So that's not terrible.
Right. No, I mean, please believe me. I'm getting a memoir out. It's being released in 2022, and it feels like, wow, that's so long from now. But I just realized I only have until March to finish it, to revise it, etc. People don't realize publishing deadlines are pretty rigid and tough. So, there's.
Can I ask, Beth Ann, have you been able to write during quarantine? How is that?
Actually, what a great question. We should ask that for every panel, but I have, and I will tell you why. It's not because I don't think about the world and don't think we're all going to hell in a handbasket right now. It's just that quarantine suits my temperament so much. I don't have to go anywhere or, interact very much. And so I really take my writing hours seriously right now in a way that when you go out and run errands, and when you're meeting so-and-so for lunch and so-and-so for coffee, this is great for me. So, but I know, I remember Celeste Ng on Twitter recently said, how is anybody getting any writing done right now? And it's like, I am Celeste. I'm sure she thinks, yeah, okay, who cares about you? No, Celeste is lovely. I'm only joking. How about you, Paul?
I'm kindred spirit on that. I started writing, my writing process is typically I do research for 6 months. Mm-hmm. And partly because the novels I write are not so much of my life, so I need to find the character, and I almost always start with setting. Setting to me establishes the environment in which the motives and ambitions, desires of characters express themselves. So setting becomes important. So the settings are Moscow or Washington, D.C. And then once I go there, the story elements come out of character, but that all takes 6 months. I create dossiers on every character. It's all about branded. I would be writing your life along with the lives of your friends and know what they were, so that then I could use those characters.
We're not going to have Brandon do that kind of research anymore, Paul. That just holds him back. And I know we have to end. This is terrible because this is really fun. I want to encourage our audience to buy The Coldest Warrior, True Story, and Real Life. All of them can be bought via bookshop.org at our 1455 link. there. And not only does that mean you can buy from your own independent bookshop if you like, but you can also support other indie booksellers at the same time. And I really encourage you to do that. This is something we can all do in this strange period of isolation to support fellow authors and fellow readers. So before Liz comes back on to see us out, I want to say thank you, Paul. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Brandon. What a delight, really. I appreciate this very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
This is amazing.
Oh, yay. I'm so glad. Liz, you can take it away when you need to. I'm not sure what we're supposed to, maybe we have more time.
I'm sorry, we don't.
Good.
I was just like mesmerized listening the whole time. But this is